Okay, so you sent us some really interesting stuff about uh, the early stages for women starting businesses, like right when it's all make or break.
Yeah, the early
Yeah,
days.
exactly. Those early
Yeah,
challenges.
absolutely.
And we're going to sort of dig into all that and try to find some of the core ideas, you know, uh, and the strategies that can help people get through all that.
Yeah, and I think the numbers are interesting to think about right off the bat. Something like 20% of new businesses, they don't make it past 2 years.
Wow.
And then within 5 years, it's almost half.
Really?
Yeah, so that's kind of the landscape we're dealing with, right? And so what we really want to understand is how female entrepreneurs not only, face those odds, but how they actually end up, building these really incredible businesses, that thrive.
Right. And it's important to remember, that these aren't just numbers on a page. Like these are real people with real stories and so much writing on this and, the stories that come out of these statistics are really inspiring. And also like they offer, I think, some practical takeaways that anyone who's starting out can use.
For sure.
Okay, so let's get into this.
Okay.
So the material you shared kind of points to like some unique or like specific challenges that women face when they're trying to launch a business.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that right at the beginning that, while obviously all entrepreneurs have to deal with obstacles, there are particular kind of layers of difficulty I think that women often have to navigate. Whether that's getting the money they need or, dealing with all the expectations that society puts on them or, even just building the right kind of support network.
Yeah, and the sources really bring this to life through a few kind of, key stories.
Yeah.
Like Spanx and Sarah Blakely.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, starting with just $5,000
Incredible.
and like all these rejections, trying to break into this like pretty well-established industry, you know?
Yeah.
What stood out to you the most about her journey and all the stuff she had to overcome early on?
I think it was just how persistent she was. And not just that she kept going, but the ways she kept going, right? Like, sources talk about all this cold calling she did and, like creative ways she would get past,
Yeah.
receptionists and things and even using feedback that she got, even if it was negative, to kind of rework how she presented her idea. Like
Yeah.
that kind of persistence, that's able to change and adapt, I think is a really important takeaway.
Right.
It wasn't just about trying over and over. It was about learning every time she was told no and finding a better way to try again.
That's a great point. It's like adaptive persistence.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like running into a wall over and over.
Right, exactly.
Right. And then you have someone like Oprah Winfrey. Before she was like the media mogul that everybody knows,
Sure.
had all kinds of setbacks and rejections in this, very male-dominated industry.
Oh, for sure.
So what does her experience kind of tell us about getting through those early storms?
I think what's interesting is if we think about it more broadly, both Blakely and Winfrey, they were in totally different fields, but they both had this incredible ability to kind of reframe those early rejections,
Yeah.
It wasn't like they were being told they weren't good enough. It was just that this wasn't the right time or the right way.
Right.
And that resilience, that ability to bounce back and to keep believing in what they were doing, even when people were saying no, that seems to be a really important part of why they were successful, in the end.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to this idea of having a good support system.
Yes.
The material really digs into how important mentorship is
Oh, absolutely.
and networks,
Yeah.
And it's something that comes up all the time when you're talking about success in business. And I think especially for women.
Yeah, and the research is clear on this. Women who are really involved in professional networks tend to be more successful in their businesses. It's not just like a nice extra thing to have.
Right.
There's data that shows a real connection.
Yeah, and the sources point to some specific people who've been really vocal about this, like Sheryl Sandberg and her, advocacy for women supporting women.
Yeah, yeah.
It's so important, and it speaks to how powerful it can be to have people who understand what you're going through.
Exactly. And Ariana Huffington talks about having this broader support system too. It's
Right.
not just about, people you meet through work. It's about having all kinds of people you can turn to, mentors, colleagues, even friends and family,
Okay.
people who can offer guidance, advice, and maybe most importantly, just be there for you emotionally when things get tough.
Yeah, because it can get really tough,
Absolutely.
So these networks, they're kind of like a sounding board, right?
Yeah.
You can test ideas, you can get feedback, and, when things get hard and you feel alone, they can give you that encouragement to keep going.
Right.
And that can really boost your confidence, right?
Totally. Knowing that other people have gone through similar things and made it out the other side can be really powerful.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting solutions. It's about knowing you're not alone in the struggle.
So based on all this, the stories and the research, the material really pulls out some practical advice,
Yeah.
like 5 key tips for navigating these early business challenges. So let's jump into those.
Okay.
The first one is to embrace failure as a learning tool.
Yeah, this is so important. I think, the road to starting a business is rarely smooth, and seeing failure not as the end of the line,
Right.
but as a chance to figure out what went wrong and learn from it is just crucial for growing and getting better.
Yeah, it's about changing your thinking from like, oh, I messed up,
Yeah.
to, okay, what did I learn here and how can I do better next time?
Right, exactly.
The second tip kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, building a strong support network.
Yeah, and it's worth saying again because the sources really highlight how important this is.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting advice and practical help.
Right.
It's also about that emotional support.
Yeah.
And as we talked about, networking can open up these doors to opportunities and insights you might never have found on your own.
Right. The third tip is all about being smart with funding,
Yeah.
which is a huge obstacle a lot of times, especially at the beginning.
For sure.
What's the key takeaway here?
I think the big thing is to explore all the different options for funding. It's not just about going to a bank. The material specifically talks about crowdfunding and angel investors,
Yeah.
which are people with a lot of money who invest in new companies for a share of the ownership.
Right.
You have to be creative and think outside the box about where that early money might come from.
Yeah, you really have to be strategic and look beyond those traditional ways of getting funding.
Exactly.
The fourth tip is to prioritize customer feedback,
Yeah.
which seems obvious,
Yeah.
but, it can be easy to forget about that when you're caught up in all the other stuff that comes with starting a business.
Yeah, in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Is that what you see?
Yeah, I think so. It's your customers who are really going to tell you if your product or service is actually meeting a need.
Right.
So getting their feedback and really listening to what they have to say, that gives you really valuable information. You can use that to make your offerings better and make sure you're on the right track to build something that people actually want.
And then the fifth tip is to keep a flexible mindset,
Yeah.
because the business world is so fast-paced and unpredictable.
Oh, totally.
Like being rigid can really hold you back.
For sure.
Is that what you found?
Yeah, I think being able to adapt your business model and being willing to change direction when you need to based on new information or, just how the market is shifting, that's really important for surviving in the long run and ultimately for being successful.
Right.
What might have seemed like the perfect plan at the beginning might need to change as you learn more about, how things really work out there.
Right. Right. Now, the material also mentions a couple of kind of, outside the box tips
Oh, yeah.
that I thought were really interesting and maybe not as obvious.
Yeah.
The first one is to really make the most of technology.
Well, yeah, in today's world, that's almost essential.
Yeah.
It's not just a nice bonus anymore.
Yeah.
Using digital tools and platforms the right way can really streamline your operations and, it can help you reach more customers. And ultimately, it lets you grow your business much more efficiently than you could have in the past.
And the second outside the box tip is to practice mindfulness,
Yeah.
which might seem a little out of place when we're talking about business,
Yeah.
but I can definitely see how it could be helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Starting a business can be so demanding and stressful. And incorporating mindfulness practices can be a powerful tool for managing that stress and, improving your focus and your clarity, which are essential for making good strategic decisions when you're in those tough situations.
Right.
A calm and focused mind is just better equipped to deal with all those inevitable ups and downs.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. The material you sent had this kind of quirky stat that women entrepreneurs are more likely to start businesses in healthcare and education.
Yeah.
What do you think that is?
I think what's interesting is that it might suggest that women are bringing unique insights and priorities to the entrepreneurial world.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that they have a deeper understanding of certain needs in those areas.
Right.
Maybe from their own experiences, or, maybe they're just more drawn to addressing certain challenges in those fields.
Right.
It definitely suggests that having diverse perspectives and backgrounds, can really drive innovation in unexpected ways.
So if we bring this all together, what would you say is the core message? The key takeaway for someone who's listening and, maybe they're in those early stages of starting a business, or maybe they're just thinking about taking that leap.
I think the main message from the material is that while being a female entrepreneur, and really any kind of entrepreneur, is definitely challenging, it can also be incredibly rewarding,
Yeah.
And the things that seem to be crucial for getting through those early hurdles are resilience.
Right.
Being able to bounce back from setbacks, the strength of your support network,
Yeah.
Both for practical help and emotional support, and then that adaptability,
Right.
being willing to learn to change and to adjust your course when you need to.
So it's really about having that inner strength
Yeah,
and the right support system around you,
totally.
to get through those tough times.
Right.
And like the material says, every challenge really can be a chance to grow, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time.
Absolutely.
It's inspiring to hear about how these women not only made it through those early struggles, but went on to build these amazing and impactful businesses.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And hopefully by, exploring these experiences and strategies, whoever's listening out there feels a little more prepared and a little more inspired
Yeah.
to face whatever challenges they're dealing with.
Absolutely.
So on that note, here's something to think about. We talked about how many women entrepreneurs are in healthcare and education.
Yeah.
What unique perspectives and insights might you bring to a certain field based on your own background and experiences?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and what concrete steps can you take, like starting today, to build a stronger and more supportive network around yourself, no matter what your goals are?
I think that's something for everyone to think about.
Yeah, for sure.